Well, I have sympathy for this kind of question. At the same time, I think that we have to study the linguistic mechanism in an autonomous way to know what they are able to do. And then...
My question is...
no, I
think one.
Yes.
Society.
And I think that one way to perhaps rephrase, or perhaps to go in the same direction, is that if you take a Rooryck basket, for example, or anything, a house, they are all the same. There is no variation with tools. So it seems to me that it is the same thing again, is that they are using recipients to make continuous, or to make shank of French calibre. They have calibers that give them the exact quantity. And perhaps because of this, they don't need how much number as we do. So if you ask a basket of potato, it's not possible that one is coming with a little basket and the other one with a big basket. So they make a lot of exchange this way.
Yeah, I understand that very well, but my question was related to other kind of societies where the numbers are here.
Yes.
Whether they have generated the actual modern system as a consequence of sedentarization.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, it's an idea that is pursued by some people, some that I take very seriously. And it seems legitimate to look at this kind of thing. I'm considering having a project to look at this type of society and at their properties in terms of exchange, art, artifact, and something, to look at this kind of thing. Without going deeper at a superficial level, I think that nobody will take what we say together seriously. But I think it could be taken seriously, but we need some more empirical evidence.
That you raised at the end, which was extremely important, that you said that there is a need for an inferential apparatus. So this is not a linguistic issue, but a so why did you put it at the end and not at the beginning? In fact, when somebody is trying to construct a sentence, he has always an idea in mind. And therefore, isn't there some kind of polarity already, which you emphasize very nicely in your proposal, which is simply due to the fact that the human brain is processing in some kind of projective style instead of input-output computer-like style, and therefore that you are always in a situation where you have an inferential apparatus being present.
You see, now I lost my answer. Let's start like with the very basics. Right? Now, what are we all understand that in order to have a language, you have to identify the sentences of the language. We need some kind of way of building a...
But you have always an objective, way of what the sentence should be.
I'm not there yet. So, there is an issue of identifying what constitutes a well-known sentence. What is logic? I don't know. My understanding is some variant of the classical model. You have a Boolean structure. For instance, if you have some kind of a domain with a bottom and a top, and three operations that are related to each other by certain laws. An orthocomplemented negation, orthocomplement means that not non-relating is back here. And then you have a join and a meet, and they are related in a certain way. This is simply my understanding of what a logic minimally is. I don't know where it comes from.
But you have these elementary systems. The invention was made of bacteria. You have already this kind of system.
Okay, sure.
Plus minus. Sure. Belgium.
Completely
Thomas has made a whole story
out of this. That's
which is valid not only for education and mention, but also but that does not contradict the idea that we may have a reorganized system.
Totally. Totally. So I'm making no claims as to where this comes from, whether it's pre-linguistic or not. I don't know. What I know is that if you cannot define language as we know it without it.
No, I think
that's simply the point.
Very important point.
And normally, you see over and over this idea that when you talk about meaning, you think either concept or reference. You think about some kind of association between a label and a content. And I'm not denying that that isn't part of the picture, but my main point is that to give it any bite, you need this stuff.
And when it's about the meaning, it's very naive understanding. You always precede the formalism of the sentence. You always want to say something.
I'm not
You are answering my questions.
I'm thinking about this as sort of abstract algebraic operations, which are non-domain specific.
This is that's what I want to say as far as the formalism of the sentence, they forget that there is somebody who has brain and is enunciating the sentence. And when he enunciates the sentence, he has always in head something to say.
Sure.
So it means that the meaning precedes the form. And I like the idea that you have an invention apparatus, because I think it's what I want to say, that you have it before, not after.
That conclusion makes me perplexed, but
Okay.
other than that,
We can continue on that.
reciprocity, one another. So if I say one another, I mean two. Okay. So how would that be expressed again? Is that possible? And the last thing is part the one you like. Because they're all related to me, right? To my friend, they're all related. If you want to understand the system, which is approximate, approximation, what do you do?
It's very interesting. Can you remind me of what you do?
The question is about plurality, plurals, and how do you, because
So,
you have other,
can you remind me of what you do? There is one missing.
No,
So we have recursivity. Recursivity is absolutely the same in Rooryck and in any other language. What's happening is just that because of the notion of other, we have a semantic limitation. So you have one, and two is one plus another, which is minimally distinct from its antecedent. And because of that, in order to introduce, let's say, three, you need one again. But this is due to the way numbers or non-discrete numbers are made. But the notion of recursivity is exactly the same. And the fact that, in fact, it looks restrictive is right, but is restricted by the interface, by the semantic interface. It does not make sense to have another alone. Another is other distinct of something. So for any other, you need something that is telling you what the other is different from. That's the only thing. So with respect to recursivity, there is absolutely no difference. And all the discussion about recursivity that I know of with respect to number and whether some indigenous languages have recursivity or not, for me, do not make sense at all. Okay? So this is point number one.
My point is, in a discrete system, perhaps you have names for small numbers, but you need the recursion type. Take one element of the lexicon, call it, and put it on the verb space, call it one. Then do the same operation, put another element, call it two. Take another element. Okay, so it has nothing to do with recursion. It has to do with how the number name or counting is done in a language. So if it's a non-discrete system, you might want to compose it with something like other or something else in such a way. So my question to you is, when suppose that you have the recursive successive function, right? And so, and in some language it would be used in a certain way. In another language, in non-discrete system, that's what I was.
But we have the recursive function, and we have the function. Okay. So there's no difference. Well, there's a difference in the way it's working. Now, with respect to plural, I'm sorry I could not come to that, but the question is extremely interesting. Because plural, to a certain extent, we have to invent the notion, I think. And the notion could be, I have to think about it whether it makes sense or not, but could be non-discrete plural. So it's almost like a mass now. So when we have plural in French or English, we have plural like, we have distributed plural to a certain extent. So enfant, for each child, you have X, 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 and this plural is expressing that. In fact, in languages like Rooryck, to my knowledge, you don't have this kind of plural, but you have a kind of group plural, which we do also have in French. Okay? When we say les gens, for example, I don't think that this plural is like les enfants. Okay? Except if you take les gens to mean each person. So, with respect to plural, we have a kind of dense plural, which is a kind of indefinite plural, which perhaps we use about more. And I think that indefinite plural should be studied. They are studied, but they are not well studied. Okay? With respect to reciprocity, I think that again it is the same. When you look at the notion of other, the notion of other is far from being homogeneous. So we have different types of reciprocal. So one type is, for example, when you put the plate one on the top of each other. And as you can see, it does not make sense because they cannot be on the top and at the bottom. So they are called chain reciprocal. I would prefer to call them indefinite reciprocal because the notion of reciprocity is very indefinite. Okay? It's more like a chain. And again, it's very reminiscent of what's going on in number. So what it shows again is that, of course, numbers in Montoku have their own life and they have an interface with core knowledge or whatever is important for number. But they have their own life and you find the same mechanism in other domains. And it happens that the notion of other and the notion of companion that I've been speaking about, companion is used for making reciprocal construction. So you can see that the notion of other is it's almost as other between us, and the third is excluded. Again, we come always to this notion that perhaps all this is related to social cognition. Okay, so thanks for allowing me to clarify this point, which is extremely interesting because we have this type of reciprocals in our language. I mean, French, English, the language that I've studied in school. And I think that very often we confuse the different type of reciprocal, or we want to reduce the fake indefinite reciprocals to reciprocity, and we do mistakes. With respect to part wall, I think that I would answer as I answered with recursivity. I think that part wall exists in all languages, but an inalienable possession, like relational terms and so on, exist everywhere. So other than exists in French, exists in Montoku, companion of exists in French, exists in Montoku. But it could be that in one language is more salient than the other language. I think this is what is going on. So to tell you what I have in mind is that I think that in France, we have dense number. We have non-continuous number, which obviously 2, 3 people again is not discrete number. So I think it's a problem of balance. In our language, these constructions are marked. In Montoku, they are as a law. And it might just be a difference of style of external language. Okay? Yes, external parameter in the sense of bounding. Yes.
Maybe we can restrict our height to approximately 2 parts.
I'll do my best. This is for Gennaro. So, during your talk, I found myself asking 2 questions. And one of them is whether non-linguistic creatures like animals or pre-linguistic creatures like human infants also make logical inferences and detect unconscious, subconscious contradictions or not. And the other question is what's related, and no more than 2 parts. The other question I was thinking about while you were talking is, what's the relation between subconscious contradictions that we detect and respond to that one interpretation, that have functional significance in terms of our interpretations, and the conscious logical reasoning that you exemplify with the case of the end and not be. And if I can start with that second one, I think that as adults looking at those two, it's very tempting to think these are both extremely easy. They're different, but we probably do them both right from the beginning. Yet, if you look at studies of children, the first kind does indeed, I think, look easy from that in language, children will very quickly assume that, if you've got 3 of something, you've also got 2 of it, and so forth. But children will find it extremely difficult to answer questions that seem trivial to us. So this goes back, Susan, help me remember this, to a study from maybe 30 years ago by Ellen Markman and Dan Osherson, where they say, I'm going to say something, just tell me, is it true or not, okay? I've got a closed hand here and there's a penny in it. Can you tell me, whether that's true or not? And kids will say correctly, no, you've got to open your hand and show me in order for me to know. But then you say, okay, I'm going to say something else. I've either got a penny in my hand or I don't have a penny in my hand. Is that true or not? And they'll say, I don't know, you've got to open your hand and show me. So it seems as if the explicit ones are developing much later. These are 5-year-olds, they know the number words, they knew some and one. I mean, all the language stuff is done, they've got it. Yet they're finding the explicit stuff really hard. And that, I think, could be explained in 2 really quite different ways, and I'm wondering how you're thinking about it. Way 1 is there is logic outside of language. It's initially unconscious. Babies are using it in non-linguistic contexts and somehow making it explicit, applying it to these verbal statements and making explicit judgments about it. Some developmental process. That would be possibility 1. But possibility 2 is, to the extent that we ever become logical, we do so by building on the apparatus that we get from our language. And that would imply that these infants and animals may be doing things that we will use logic to describe. We'll say that a baby in an experiment where you see an object exists and then you see it doesn't exist, we'll describe that as there's a contradiction there and the baby reacts to the contradiction, but the baby may not be applying some domain general logic in detecting that contradiction. The action from the language. So that was probably as long-winded as it can be. But I'm wondering if you could say something about what you think the relation is between inferences in language and outside language and inferences in consciousness and outside language.
But also the soundbite is long. Final part of your question. Animals have logic in the same sense. Doesn't seem to be so. At low level is a way. Certainly, in order to describe their behavior, you have to use ands and ors and not and sense. So any kind of navigation device will have to describe humans connected. Their characteristic is that they are extremely domain specific. They apply to that routine and nothing more. By contrast, the logic that you see overlapping in language is extremely domain dependent. And if I'm right, it applies equally well to hardcore semantic notion, but also to pragmatically driven ones in a sort of the same way. So this is the first part of the answer. So yeah, there is some precursors of logical operators that you can notice probably in animals. They're very sparse, extremely domain specific as you know, I was telling Jose when he presented this stuff, you don't see the kind of interaction that you see immediately, right? Now the second question is really, you know, a request to elaborate a bit more on what I'm saying about the emergence to conscience.
To the second type of one.
Yeah, to the second type of article, exactly. So adults don't have great difficulty in detecting that train and it doesn't train is a contradiction. So for now, I have this quasi-algorithmic device sifting this apart, basically this replacement. Now the sort of functional correlate of that is that the cases where you are aware of the contradictoriness or tautologous in the adult case are always cases that involve recognition of the same item. So it trains and it doesn't train. And it always involves things that have a level of complexity that makes the surface to conscience. And in fact that it also enables a repair strategy, because you tend to interpret the thing in such a way as not to make it contradictory. And it's precisely because the complexity of the configuration of symbols is such that you can make a diagnosis of what's wrong with it, that you can fix it. In my cases, the cases that I call a cheat reality, there is no way for you to see it, right? Because there's simply no way, no replacement will work. No replacement will work. So that is where I would start. And also, I would attempt at studying the development of it sort of much in the same way. I have a question for Gennaro in roughly 2 parts. Now, I was also wondering about the claim that there are any books on the table is a contradiction. Right? It's a very interesting claim, of course. And then the question arises why it feels different from Pierre Pica. Right? And then you provided when we had to talk an interesting answer. And you also said at some point that there are any books on the table is different from agreement, crucially different from agreement, and goes more with contradiction. On the other hand, I was wondering if, by the way, this business of the different feeling, the different reactions that we have with respect to such stimuli, is a domain in which maybe brain imaging techniques could be of help. Because you could, you know, if you have some kind of reliable signature of different sorts of violations. What I was wondering about in connection with this example is that if I understood correctly, though, there is one difference between the 2 cases, which to some extent still classifies the negative polarity item with agreement, which is locality. Right? So you basically have to establish a relation between 2 positions, and this relation is subjected to locality constraints. So it could be that it is this kind of violation that makes us jump and that makes children jump, right? And that we immediately react to, and that's different from the P and not P, which requires some other type of processing of computation. Okay, so that's one part. And the second part, but I don't want to distract you while you are writing.
Reading from your beliefs.
Yeah, I'll tell you the second part, which is about the the parallel that you draw between merge and infer. In a sense, the two labels cover very different things, right? So merge, very simple. Infer looks like a program, huge computation there. So we may ask the question, what is the merge of infer? I mean, what are the basic ingredients that we want to put in infer box?
Very good. Let me address first your first question. So the basic idea is that any contains an event, right? And of course, event is code, right? And so in this case, it has no choice. There is code here. Now, whatever relation is in this position is satisfied. So syntactically, it is perfectly well formed. It just crashes because of the meaning of it. If, on the other hand, you have a patient, now you have two sides where you can satisfy this that are equally close enough to the target. Either here, and then you would replicate the situation that you had before, or here. And in which case, you have both the locality map and the semantic condition map. So in other words, you need both. You need both. But the point is that under this view, now, typical MPI violation, the problem is that the syntax is perfect. You do need this other stuff. The second question is, what are the building block of infer? And that is just like with numbers. It's, in a sense, their inferential potential. Okay? So when you learn and, learning and, this learn that if you have P and Q, you have Q. Learning or is to know that if you have P or Q, you don't. So infer tells you that going from here to here is fine, and going from here to here is not. And you need very few things. You know, it's a very small set of units that immediately generates a host through nesting of this extremely simple operation. You get a host of consequences immediately. And you know, I've been referring to Boolean structure for ease of reference. But the actual, probably the logic that leads through language bears a strong family relationship with that. But it's not exactly necessarily a Boolean structure. There are all these operators that given, it's the logical operator, it's only, it's another logical operator, and so on and so forth. Right? And each one comes with a very small, very simple set of elementary inference schemata that immediately generate a cascade through the version of consequence that permeates the whole system and we seem to compute remarkably fast.
Just a short question. I was extremely interested by your idea that all of these computations are non-conscious. So if this is true, it extends considerably, I think, the sort of demonstrations that we have of the power of non-conscious abilities. Of course, you have to take non-conscious with a grain of salt because the subject is attending to the sentence. And so the words are conscious, but what you mean is that the computation is of course, there are many of these kind in syntax. Exactly. The one you are describing, I don't know if you provided a complete description of what is the unconscious computation exactly. I'm interested in exactly that. Do you think that there can be a sequential aspect to this computation, or is it just a sort of parallel processing of all of the constraints in the sentence? It would be extremely interesting to me if you could prove that there is in fact a sequence of steps that unfold. And I was wondering, for instance, if you have a sentence where there are multiple terms, like any child can take some sweets. Or something like that. Would you be able to show that there are sequential steps in the computation that are all unfolding non-consciously?
Well, Stan, I'm going to give your help on this. Because I do not know how this happens. The parallel that you made with syntax is extremely well taken, right? So if, Ricci and Luigi are right on how, say, a relative clause is computed, that involves, a set of steps that we are not aware of that take place. And we don't know exactly how they take place, and that is the issue of how parsing happens. And it's fully parallel in my domain. I know that there are certain operations that must take place, and yes, they do take place in a certain order, basically composition. How exactly that happens in real-life parsing, we have to decide again. The kind of effects that I was alluding towards the end, this kind of like minimality, like intervention type effects, those are ubiquitous. So I was trying to make a case that the reason why there is this kind of intrusion in certain dialects of implicatures in the computation of the meaning of any is precisely because of the order in which they have to take place. So each operator must target the closest possible target. So you hit an implicature bearer first, you have to plug in the implicature first, and then that restarts. Now that mechanism is extremely pervasive.
Do you know how long it takes? Or how long this computation can unfold unconsciously?
I think that is precisely the question to ask. Like, we must find ways of studying online effects of this very phenomenon.
I have this data, I think.
Great.
So I have a data set on any violations, a combined EEG and MEG study, and I'm struggling with the data, but I can just tell you sort of factually. In the ERP data, so we're trying to establish links between MEG and EEG. We had the typical syntactic violation, which we all know. We know that it elicits effects around 600 milliseconds. That's exactly what we found for a syntactic violation. The any violation elicited much later, in fact, around 1,000 milliseconds.
So you're talking about when an any is not in the scope of a downward-oriented operator, and that is important, and that it's certainly a first step. But there is a second step that is even more intriguing, right? And those are the intervention facts that are sort of systematic, systematic but more subtle, right? So people get a contrast between, say, something like, I doubt that John drank the beer or any of the coffee, which is kind of okay, versus I doubt that John drank the beer and any of the coffee, which is degraded. Don't stop and don't try to decide now between these pairs. Okay? Assume that something like that is true. it needs to be shown, it needs to be proved. But assume that it's true. Then that would be a kind of intrusion effect. So negation and triggers an implication, right? So something like, I won't see both Luigi and Rizzi. Suggests that I will see one of them. I won't see either Luigi and Rizzi, no implication. So negation and and triggers an implication, and that may disrupt the polarity. So these kind of effects that are more subtle than simply figuring out what happens under negation, this would be very exciting to probe and study with experimental techniques, because they would make the level of the discussion jump by a considerable notch. It's hard, it's hard, but it should be feasible eventually. Sorry.
Oh, Nora, am I next?
Well, no.
I mean, it sort of built on that, but it's not.
We have 10 minutes. Okay, then that's that.
So, I'm totally with you on the sort of logical, philosophical, linguistic sort of presentation that you made. The discussion has taken the turn of talking about a performance model, and that's sort of notoriously a step that is kind of a difficult one to take. And what Lena brought up really brings up something that's been bothering me that I wasn't going to ask, because I really thought it was not really about the sort of central stream of your project, but since we're getting into performance models, let me ask you if you worried about the fact that there's an enormous tradition dating back to Wason and Johnson Laird that shows that human adults are actually not very good at lots of these inferences. And that isn't to say that they couldn't be, or there may be motivational reasons or working memory reasons why they're very bad. But does that bother you, or it's not relevant?
Well, I find it interesting, and yes, maybe it's not relevant to my task, because those kind of failure of performance. So I try to distinguish between what I call grammatical triviality and logical triviality. Grammatical triviality is in some sense mechanical. There are not going to be failures there in a lot of grammars. Logical triviality, on the other hand, is not. There can be all sorts of non-failures. To be to related linguistic motion. The Johnson-Laird style model of mental logics guys in Chicago, mental logic. It's they are concerned with logical, what I call logical triviality.
Right.
They are related, but they are different, and they are kind of orthogonal. The claim is that what they call grammatical triviality, which is a small subset of logical triviality, enters into the definition of grammar.
So do you know in terms of, that's why I asked the question following on Nina, do you know that that is trivial in the way you suggest in terms of the performance model? I get that it's included in the grammar, but humans do it. Maybe they just do it slowly, but I just don't know if it's well studied.
I think it's not studied at all, also because, first of all, it's a pretty wide claim, and I may be totally wrong. But the claim is what you saw. It's the only way of making sense that I can think of the existence of this negative polarity. The only thing that makes sense is that these kind of things come out at a certain level as logical form. So that's the claim. That entails that you compute this automatically, quickly, just like you compute grammatical. And this is the stone Not by myself. Like, so there are a number of us that believe this. But it is controversial even within those segments of language.
I'd like to ask a short but continuous question that spans Pierre and Gennaro and some of Jean-Pierre Changeux's remarks. With respect to Pierre, there are various questions about Rooryck that come to mind in an obvious way. One is whether that kind of language has a way of expressing the notion exactly in the way that we say exactly for, etc. Another is whether or not they have a notion like have with respect to mass now. So could they say, give me half that sugar? Or how would they express that? Or do they have a notion of division into equal parts? There are other ways of getting at notions that are related to number notions, even if they're not exactly the same. A different kind of question relates to the fact that you mentioned other Amazonian languages, and obviously one would want us, and that would be an ideal testing ground for all of this, because comparing Rooryck directly to European languages is not the ideal comparison. And thinking of one of Jean-Pierre Changeux's remarks, one would like to know whether hunter-gatherer languages in places like the New Guinea Highlands or the Khoisan languages of South Africa or some languages of Central Africa have also been said to have number systems like the Rooryck system. Is there some kind of correlation of interest there? With respect to Gennaro's talk, I had trouble at the very beginning because if I understood correctly, which I may not have, when he was asking about answers to questions like how many of those papers will you be grading tonight? And you can answer not even one, but you could not answer even one. And I took him to say that the reason was that one didn't correspond to the notion least likely. But in my English at least, it doesn't depend on the number one, so that if the question is how many of those 10 papers you're going to grade tonight, not even one is fine, not even 6 is fairly good, but even 6 is not good, and even 10 is not good. So I don't quite see how this notion of least likely actually fits in.
Shall I, because this is my part is so, of course, the distribution of probability depends.
This is just a magic stick.
So, how many of those 10 papers? What was your distribution of answers, Luigi? What was your distribution of judgments?
That not even plus some numeral was always better than even plus some numeral, independently of numeral.
Yeah. Well, normally, what you would expect is that in the case of the positive, the high number is better. So, how many of those papers will you grade? Even of them, all 10 of them. That's not too bad.
Not good.
Well, it's a matter of confidence, no? So, even all 10 is maybe possible, but even 1 is much worse. At any rate, it doesn't matter, I don't care. This is the logic. This is definitely the logic. So, you see in language after language, even associated with one. And that is a canonical way of forming MPIs about 1/3 of the language.
And even associated with
also certain interpretation that is contradictory.
I'm not seeing the difference between one and two.
What can I do for you? So, you know, the logic of the thing can be repeated is as follows. In the positive number series, normally the entailment goes from the high number to the lower. Even is associated with this least expected thing. If you associate it with a low number, since it is entailed by all the others, it can never work. The others may or may not work, depending on all sort of contextual factors. But the lowest number will tend not to work because it's being entailed by every expressed.
So to put it with 10, this is the problem.
That is good. So, for instance, if the numbers are exact, then all bets are off. Because if the numbers are exact, then there is no entailment. And therefore the probability distribution has to come from that. So that's, that is always the structure of this reasoning. Another way to be easier to see is like this minimizing. A dam. Give a dam. Give some quantity that is so small that you cannot possibly care for just that quantity. And that is a positive context, is even interpretation we tend to crash by the same problem. In a negative context, reversal entailment becomes the strongest mechanism. That is the mechanism. What is extraordinary is that thing that is so confusing to our conscience, simply language is doing. You see, over and over, like, you can say neanche uno. You don't say neanche uno. Unless due becomes the minimal element of the theory. Non ho visto neanche due studenti. It has to be that 2 is the minimum. Non ho visto neanche 10 studenti. It has to be that 10 is the minimum. It's not the minimum, it doesn't work.
This is what happens if somebody says this question is easy to answer. Can you quickly answer this question because we only have 1 hour and we are already
I'm going to try to answer to Luigi, but I think the serious answer was with respect to we have exact numbers who I would say that surprisingly most numbers are used for small quantities because small quantities are subject or are sensitive to polarity. I think they have this indefinite meaning. They are not exact. What is surprising is that if you say 7, then which is barely used. But if you say 7, I don't think it means 7 or 8. I think it really means 7. But I take this to indicate that the way it is made is the unit is too big to be interpreted as download intelligence. Then you don't have the effect. So it's as if when you go on 5, you go to either something with Q's or Q's with respect to when you ask, do you have parts? Yes, we have parts, and it's possible to say, well, we have a half, a quarter. And it seems that we could say, okay, then we have something precise, but half or some does not seem to be extremely precise. So the notion of half itself, has the notion of repetition, other seems to be precise, but half of something that I don't know what it is about does not seem to be very precise. So I would suggest again that or half a handful is it precise? I'm not sure. I think again that we clearly have the notion of half, we clearly have the notion of quarters, we clearly have binary notions, but I'm not sure they are precise. What it means, I don't know, and I think again that we need to go to the field and ask the right question.